Hi, and welcome to the Your Story Studios podcast, a podcast where we talk about all things content creation. Today on the podcast, we have Aiden.
Hey.
And today we are talking about podcasting. So, Aiden, tell me about podcasting.
This is very meta that we're discussing podcasting and the art of podcasting on a podcast.
And some tips and tricks as well about podcasting.
Well, if you're
Hopefully,
lucky.
yeah.
Very meta, very Inception sort of thing. Yes, podcasting has been around for a long time, but I think it's really only in the last sort of maybe 3 or 4 years where it's really, the general public know what it is other than just nerds in a basement like it was 20 years ago.
And everyone has a podcast these days or can have a podcast if they want.
Yeah, can we this is a point of contention for me. Stop making podcasts. Everyone, can you just stop? I want to be the only one. I don't want to have to compete with everyone's podcast. It's very frustrating.
Yes, I can imagine.
Leave us to us OGs, please. Come on.
Well, you're a podcasting OG. Tell me about your very first podcast that you were involved in or created.
Yeah, so I've had several podcasts over the years. The very first one was one called Cider House Rules, where me and a friend would drink ciders and we would talk about ciders, and it was more of a comedy conversation type thing, but it was probably too niche. They say that the key to a good podcast is finding a niche, finding a lane that nobody else is in, and that's, carving that area for yourself. The crossover Venn diagram between cider drinkers and comedy just wasn't quite there. Yeah, it didn't quite work.
Yeah.
But we had fun.
Yeah, well, that's the main thing. And I think when you first started, fun was probably the fuel that kept you making that podcast. Is that correct?
Oh, totally. I think it's interesting, like you and I are roughly the same age. Men need an excuse to hang out. It's very rare that you call up a friend and go like, hey, let's just hang out. You need an excuse. So I've had several podcasts over the years where it was just so that I could catch up with that particular friend. I hosted several different shows with people that I just really wanted to spend time with. But because I'm a man in my 30s, I couldn't just say, let's hang out. Instead, there had to be a reason. So
It has to be a project.
Exactly.
Yeah. And with Cider House Rules, your very first podcast, do you have any key learnings that you have taken away from creating that very first podcast?
Oh, every podcast I've had along the way, I've learnt something and then tweaked it, and then learnt something for the next one and tweaked it, and, progressively got better and better. Hopefully everyone does it, what they do. If you've been doing it for long enough, you should be getting better. But yeah, I've learned different things, just simple things like that first 2 weeks that your podcast is out there in the world, get as many of your friends to rate and review it. As many as possible, because it'll bump it up in the chart and it'll get more exposure and stay in that chart longer. More people find it. But that first 2 weeks is key. And I literally just text all my friends. If I'm launching a new podcast, I think you've received one.
I have.
Send the text out. Just, hey, I need you to rate and review this right now. Hit subscribe just for these first 2 weeks. You can unsubscribe in 2 weeks later, whatever. I don't care. But I just need this to start the algorithm, get people noticing.
And is that something that is consistent with podcasting? Because I know YouTube changes their algorithm all the time. So I think currently its watch time is one of the key indicators is if a video is good. It's not just how many subscribers someone has or how many likes the video has. It's how long people are actually watching it.
Yeah, it depends on the platform.
Yeah. Okay.
So Apple Podcasts or iTunes, whatever you want to call it, has different things that they prioritize as opposed to Spotify. They have different things that they approve of and really want you to do. They all vary. So it's hard, but the key is subscribers, really. You want as most amount of people to be listening to your show. So if you can get the most amount of subscribers, that's a big indicator. The amount of time listened is more of a priority for Spotify. They prioritize that higher because it's streaming, whereas usually Apple Podcast, you're downloading it. Most of the time it's downloaded. So whether you listen or not is irrelevant. It's more the subscription or those reviews, those positive reviews are what they sort of prioritize. Now, there's probably experts in your comment section right now arguing with me, but as of the point of recording this is the correct information. It changes every week.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So it is quite, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to keep up with, but
why do you think they change it so often?
I think they get bored and they like, like being a puppet master and dance for me,
Yeah, I find it confusing, especially with YouTube. Like, why do they change like all these things all the time? Like, why are they trying to make it harder? And then you have to watch videos that say, oh, YouTube's changed the algorithm and now they're prioritizing this. And then you're like, are they?
Well, that's the thing. It depends what you're chasing. I've watched so many videos as well on Instagram as far as like Instagram's prioritizing this and you've got to get this. I actually don't really care though. I'm not chasing the likes on Instagram. I'm chasing downloads on my podcast. So I'll put up tiles, promoting my podcast, and I know it's not going to get many likes. I know it's not going to engage with too many people, but I just want people to know that there's a new episode out and you should go onto a different platform to download my podcast. Now, that's obviously not what Instagram wants. They don't want you to leave their platform. So, it's a catch-22. It's tough. If you're trying to chase the algorithm, are you really doing the best job? Like really what you should be pouring your time into is the actual product and making sure listeners are getting the best thing possible. So, yeah.
Yeah, making good content is, number one. Yeah,
content king.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So with Cider House Rules, what made you wrap that podcast up and then move on?
Well, I moved location. It became harder to do. We're talking, over 10 years ago. So Zoom wasn't really an option.
Yeah, it wasn't a thing yet.
No. So it just became
Skype
harder
was
and harder.
there, but yeah.
Yeah, but you couldn't record from Skype. It was low quality. There was all sorts of limitations with that. So that was a physical reason for wrapping it up because of location. Other podcasts that I've wrapped up, we've run out of material or, people got different jobs and they no longer had enough time. Natural conclusion has come from different ways of wrapping different podcasts up.
So what was the next podcast that you then moved on to after doing Cider House Rules?
So from Cider House Rules, I really poured my time into radio for a few years. And then I had this...
Learned a few things along the way.
Yeah. And then I had
some connections.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
And I had this horrible boss that was like, we're going to take you off the radio for a few weeks because we don't think you're good enough. And I was like, cool, great. I'm going to start a podcast then and I'm going to be really good at it and show you. And I did. And I started Vinyl Soul, which was an interview-based podcast chatting to musicians about where they got their musical style and where they got their musical influences, which sounds very cliched these days. But again, this is roughly 10 years ago and nobody was really having in-depth conversations. I was so frustrated with these like 3-second interviews that people would do on the radio and that was like, oh, you've got a new song out. Well, eat a cake while you tell us about it, like silly games that radio people would make them do. So I was like, I think there's a market for real conversations with musicians. So that's where the origin of Vinyl Soul came from.
Yeah, and then I guess in hindsight, you can look back and be like, oh yeah, I was onto something. Because you look around today and you're like, oh wow, there's so many podcasts similar to this.
Oh, there's thousands of that. And I'm not saying I invented it. I'm not saying I started it. But at the time, there wasn't much around. And that's what I wanted to listen to. So I often find the best podcast, the best anything, is when you create something that you genuinely want. You feel the need for that and you go, oh, that's what I would love. And then create it yourself. And hopefully there's enough people like you that also want to be a part of that and want to listen to it and things.
And looking back at Vinyl Soul, when you were creating that podcast, what was, I guess, the main fuel that was keeping it going? Was it the downloads? Was it a really super popular podcast and you felt like you just had to keep creating it? Or was it more passion project, I'll show you boss at the time?
Oh, all of the above. I really loved that podcast because I did have access. I was working in a, top end commercial radio job and I had access to some really amazing people. So
you want to name drop?
I was sitting down with Andy Lee from Hamish and Andy to discuss trumpets and all of his, musical interests was just amazing. Just sitting there with somebody that you've seen on TV all the time or, Living End or Grinspoon, bands that I grew up listening to, actually sitting down and actually hearing from them what music they liked to listen to when they were growing up and stuff. Like I really loved doing that podcast. And yeah, I won a few awards for it and it got reasonably successful at the time. But when I lost my job in commercial radio, it became very hard to get access to these interviews. I'd built up a reputation and I continued it for a fair bit after I was made redundant, but it just became harder and harder. And I unfortunately had to wrap it up because I just didn't have that accessibility anymore.
Yeah. And then you moved on to another podcast.
Yeah. Okay. So then I did 2 sort of podcasts simultaneously just with friends. And goes back to what we were talking about, like excuses to hang out with friends. So I did Dad's Guide, where it was me and a mate just chatting about dad issues. We were both new parents at the time. And so we would discuss parenting issues and offer somewhat advice.
And this was during COVID, wasn't it, as well?
Yeah. And then I did another one called My First Time, where me and 2 other friends would either watch a film or do a social activity that one of us had never done before or never seen before, and we were doing it for the first time, and then we would talk about it. So we went to Bikram Hot Yoga, and then we watched, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures, just random obscure films and things. And
I saw pro wrestling.
Yes, we did. You could tell us a lot about that.
I like that episode. That was good.
And that one I wasn't in charge of. I was just a guest. Oh, well, I was on every episode, but I was just a host. So I don't even know how many downloads that got. Could have got 2. Could have got 2 million. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I got at least 1.
Yeah.
But there was some fun in that because I'd put a lot of work into Vinyl Soul. It was really time consuming. Consistency is key. So releasing episodes, whether it be every day or every week, whatever you pick, but it's consistency. And so I really enjoyed these social podcasts because I could step back and just come on and tell jokes and muck around and not have that pressure to make sure I had a new episode pumping out every week and things.
And then you didn't have to edit it either.
Didn't edit. It's great.
Yeah. Tell me, has your first time, obviously it's wrapped up because you're now in Geelong, Australia, and that was being recorded in Adelaide,
yes,
South Australia.
Well, we did record for a full 2 years, I think, while Dan, one host, was living in Whyalla, a town of about 3 people. And I'm pretty sure we have recorded one episode that never got released, like it was the last one. I'm still waiting, Dan. Where's our episode? Where is our episode, Dan? I think it was Fast Times at Rigamont High. You know that film from the 80s? Or Fast Times at somewhere?
I remember you saying that you were going to watch it, I think, and the episode never came.
I know I told some inappropriate jokes on that episode, so it's probably best it wasn't ever released. But yeah, we've never officially pulled the pin on that one. We could come back and release some new episodes, but we haven't in maybe 2 or 3 years now. So
just talk me through the actual production side of doing My First Time. You just mentioned that you were doing remote stuff as well. I'm pretty sure I've listened to nearly every episode of My First Time, and I always thought that you're welcome. And I always thought that you guys were all in the same room together. Is that not true?
Yeah. So the first 2 years we would record in radio studios, and then Dan moved away, and we recorded via. I think we did some on Zoom. We think we did some on Riverside. We used a few different platforms, working out what worked best. Yeah, it didn't stop us. The fact that we were, thousands of kilometers apart, it was fine. It obviously works better in the room. You can get a more natural flow going when you're there in the room with someone. But technology is great these days. Like it has come so far that you really have no excuse.
Yeah, technology is great when it works.
Yeah, we're all recording. We're recording. We're good.
We're recording. Yeah, it tells me. Yep, it's all good. So moving on from that podcast, you're now onto your current podcast.
Yes.
Tell me a bit more about that.
My current award-winning podcast.
I'd like you to refer to that. Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
Currently, you're producing a podcast which is award-winning.
Thank you.
Songs That Changed You.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
So this started as an idea that my wife had for a radio segment, and then it grew and grew and grew. And I was like, I don't want the radio station to own this. I want this to be mine. And so I struck a deal with them where I was like, hey, I'm going to play this on the radio. You can have it for free, but I'm going to create this for me, and I'm going to own it. And they were like, yep, cool. So yeah, Songs That Change You. It's a weekly podcast. So I'm really passionate and really rigid in that it has to come out every week. It comes out Tuesday night at 7:30 every single week.
Why that time?
Oh, it's just the best time the kids are in bed,
Okay. Because I'm struggling right now trying to figure out when I should release my podcast. And right now it's midnight Australian time on Fridays. And that's just because that's when I posted my first one. Or actually, no, I just end up landing on that time. Or it was a Friday. So are there any tips and tricks on days, times, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So generally weekdays are better. And there's no better day as far as Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but Friday isn't great because you are getting into weekend mode. So often people listen to podcasts on their commute. Mm-hmm. So whether you want to release it first thing in the morning or last thing at night, that does help. It plays into it. That being said, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, isn't it? So depends on what market you're chasing, or a global market, it's going to work somewhere. So for my podcast, I release at 7:30 on a Tuesday. A lot of it is to do with logistically. Like I have put the kids to bed and I like to personally hit publish on it. I don't like to schedule it. I like to hit publish. And the reason for that is that I do a interview, and that could be recorded at any time. But the little intro part that I do at the beginning that just goes for like a minute or two, I record that day because I want it to be current. And if you record that in advance, I have done that occasionally when I've gone on holidays and stuff, and it's just dated so quickly. I might have referenced something and it's like, oh no, that's not relevant anymore, or that's not true anymore. So I like to record that on the day, and then I come home from work and I upload it. And I've already done the artwork for it. I've already done the bio, the write-up, all that sort of stuff. But I like to do the physical hit publish just to make sure it's out there. And, if I've got something on, I'll schedule it in advance. But yeah, Tuesday nights. And I like the idea that they might get it Tuesday night, but ideally they're waking up on Wednesday morning and going, there's a new episode. There it is.
Yeah, because I used to, when you first started, I'd notice it because I check in the morning podcasts and I'd see it Wednesday morning. So in my mind, you released the podcast on a Wednesday. But then I realized one night for some reason I was looking at my podcast and it was a Tuesday night past 7:30, I guess.
Yeah.
And I saw there was a new episode. I was like, oh, okay. And I never noticed you promoting like a time that you're releasing it.
No, and I don't make that public for you, of course.
Thank you. Thanks for the insider knowledge.
Yeah. No, some weeks it might be slightly later, slightly earlier. It's not a rigid as far as it has to be 7:30, but it's just, I know for me, like it has to be Tuesday night and it's the kids are in bed. It's the best time for me. Now, if I was really mathematical, probably if I'd scheduled it for, I don't know, 5 a.m. on a Wednesday might technically be better.
Right.
I think.
But then you're not getting up at 5 a.m. to
No, and I don't like scheduling. I like actually hitting publish and stuff. You got to sort of draw a line at some point whether you're releasing the podcast for you or for listeners. And if I'm feeling like it's a chore, I don't really want that. I want to enjoy it.
You did mention that you do have a weekly schedule. Are you starting to find after doing, because how long's this podcast been going for? It's been
this is in its second year.
Yeah. So is it starting at any point to feel like a chore having that deadline every single week?
Yes and no. The deadline only really hurts when I can't find a guest.
And that's my next question. You've had a lot of guests because you don't really have repeat guests, do you?
I try not to, no.
Yeah. So there's a new guest there is a new guest every week.
Yeah.
How do you find them? How do you lock them in? How do you schedule it around a full-time job and also being a husband and father of two? Tell me your secrets.
Sorry, I think you missed a brilliant husband, an amazing father of two.
Absolutely. Sorry, let me correct that. Yep. How do you manage all of that?
Well, because it does get played on the radio, I do justify the fact that I use some work time to work on it. So the way I usually do it is if I find somebody on Instagram that I'm like, oh, they would be good on the podcast. Oh, they've got their email in their bio. Perfect. I'll screenshot it. Just any time in the week, like if I just find somebody, I'll just screenshot it. And then maybe like once a month, I'll go through all the ones that I've screenshotted and put into my podcast guest folder. And then I will send off an email blast. I will email every single one. And let's say I'm emailing maybe 15 to 20 guests. I'll probably email at once. Maybe, somewhere around there. Law of averages, you get 10% replies. So for every 20 guests I invite on, 2 reply saying yes.
Mm.
So it's a numbers game.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty strict with who comes on the podcast. I do a lot of research. I want to know that there's a market for it. I want to know that there's an interest. What they've got to talk about is actually something that my listeners want to hear about. So there's certain guests that I sort of and on and go, I just don't think they're right. Or there's not enough people that will actually be interested in hearing from them. Getting together that list is hard. I'm always up for people suggesting people to come on. And my wife does a good job of that. She does send me like DMs on Instagram, like, get this person. I'm like, okay, sure. She likes to claim she's a producer of the show,
and a guest as well.
She has been a great guest. Yeah. But yeah, to call her a producer would be a bit generous. She's maybe lined up 2 of my 70 guests, I think.
Yeah, you've had quite a few guests. But also talk me through now the technical side of producing the podcast. Where are you recording? What are you recording with? Talk me through that process.
So after I send the email, we agreed on a time, and often I have guests that are in America, so working out that time difference is a pain. But eventually we lock it in, and if they're not in the room, I do it via Zoom. If they're in the room, obviously there's no need for any of that sort of technology, but we're in the studio. So I record at a radio studio where it's high quality mics and things, and I don't have to fork out the money to buy them myself. These are nice. So I will record in Audacity, Pro Tools. There's hundreds of different programs. They're all the same.
Yeah.
You
don't have a preference?
Look, whichever one's free.
Audacity.
Yeah, Audacity is usually my go-to.
Yeah.
It's got a few limitations, but for what you're doing, an audio-based podcast, it really doesn't need to be fancy.
Yeah, well, I've found that with your podcast, they do sound very good.
Thank you.
So do you have any tips or tricks to make them sound not so echoey or, unprofessional?
Well, I do record in a radio studio.
Yeah.
So that helps.
That's a bit of a hack, isn't it?
It's got the padding. It's got the right sound equipment. But I do.
So you record all of them, even if they're remote, or if they're.
I've done 1 or 2 where it's been with a mic at a hotel room or something like that. Those ones don't sound as good. That's always the way. But there are tricks to reduce the noise.
And have you educated yourself in trying to learn all that kind of stuff, or have you handed it off to other people to?
No, I do everything, and it's usually a YouTube tutorial which I'm watching going, all right, select that, do this, trying to figure it out. If I need help, I will ask somebody. It's not like I'm too good to ask anyone, but it's just more like I don't want to burden them. I will try my best first to solve the problem. But I think a lot of people think that it has to be, you don't have to be perfect.
No.
Because people, particularly because of COVID, since COVID, we've got so used to things not being perfect with audio quality, for better or worse. But it has dropped the standards a little bit. And so now it's pretty acceptable to hear an interview where somebody is on the phone. Now, previously, you wouldn't listen to that for a half an hour. It'd be like, I'm not sitting listening to this. It sounds horrible. But these days, people are a little bit more open to that. So I've dropped my standards a little bit as far as holding myself accountable. It's got to be perfect. No, it just has to be heartfelt. It just has to have a human connection moment. That's more important. The content is more important than the actual quality of listening,
Yeah, absolutely. And after you have captured this amazing, life-changing content,
thank you.
What's the next step in the production pipeline?
Yeah, so let's say for me, I record for about, I do bite-sized episodes. I usually want them to go for about 20 minutes. So I'll probably record for about half an hour with a guest and edit it down to 20 minutes. There'll always be 1 or 2 questions where literally as I'm having the conversation, I'm mental noting going, yeah, this is going to make it. This part's going to be chopped out. I'm going to edit this here. And that comes from years of experience and going, yeah, I think I can tweak this and whatever. But then I'll sit with the episode and I will probably edit. A rule of thumb is double the amount of time that is recorded. So if it's a half an hour episode, it'll take me about an hour to get it to what I want it to be.
Are you cutting ums and ahs out and that kind of stuff?
I don't take breaths out. I don't take, sometimes I'll take an sometimes I will. It won't. It depends if the flow's there. you don't want it to sound robotic. You want people to come across as human. So there was one episode, I won't say who it was, but it was on Songs That Changed You, where the woman that I was interviewing said, right at the very end, she goes, oh, can you take out that part where I talked about blah? And I was like, yeah, cool. But like that led to everything else that came after that. What am I meant to do here? So that one I had to get pretty creative to try and link things and work out how to remove that. And I made it work. It turned out to be a really good episode and people got a lot out of it. And she was really thankful and she promoted it on her social media and stuff. So it was worth doing. But that's the way it is, you know. Occasionally you got to make these big chunky edits for the sake of the guest, really.
Yeah. And so you've uploaded your podcast, people are listening to it, you're promoting it. What's the best way you've found to promote your podcast other than texting people, what you've already mentioned?
Yeah, look, I'm very big on knowing my limitations. So I know that I can produce a great episode. But like you mentioned before, I've got kids, I've got a wife, I've got a full-time job. I don't want them to suffer because I'm sitting there like promoting my podcast that is essentially a free product for people to listen to, you know? So I do a social tile for it each week. If I'm organized, I'll try and do a video with the text coming up, a little grab from the episode. But, you know, I would love to be doing it full time. I would love to have somebody to work with me and we could do different stuff, but I just know my limitations and I don't want my children to suffer. I don't want them to hate the fact that dad's got a podcast and he doesn't play with us, you know?
Yeah,
so I just do what I can.
Yeah.
I would love to promote it more. And look, go listen. Can we have it? Songs That Change You. It's written right here. It's not really, is it?
No, I'll put it there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So with promoting your podcast as well, do you find it helpful having the guests promoted as well?
Absolutely.
And then what's the best way to get the guests to promote the podcast?
So again, this is something I've learned along the way, but I send a follow-up email. As soon as the episode drops, I'll reply to them like, hey, thank you so much for being on the show. Here's a link to the Apple podcast. Here's a link to the Spotify. Here's the graphic that I've used. Here's the link to the Instagram post about it. I'd love it if you could share it on your socials. And most people are pretty good about it. They probably will, but I'll just ask. I just say like, you don't know until you ask.
And the worst thing they can say is no.
Exactly. Or not reply.
Yeah.
Like, I just think too many people are scared to ask questions to like, oh, I couldn't ask them. Oh, just do it. Who cares?
Yeah.
You're sitting on a computer. You never have to see their facial reaction. So I'll send off emails and ask them to promote it. I'll slide into people's DMs where we've talked about them. Oh, you're mentioned on this podcast. You should take a listen. Or you're mentioned, you should share it with your fans. And sometimes I get replies, sometimes I don't.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's a helpful tip. And one thing that I'm curious about as well is with your podcast, it is audio. Is there a reason you haven't done video podcasts?
Because my friend that's really good at video lives too far away.
Who could that be?
Look, I'd love to. It's a limitation thing. Yep. I don't know video editing very well. I've done a tiny little bit of it at uni 20 years ago type thing. Like, I'm sure that's irrelevant. I would love to do that, but it's just knowing what I'm good at and knowing what I would have to learn too much and sacrifice. So
knowing your limitations once again.
Yeah. I just think I think sometimes we force ourselves, and particularly you see it with kids, we force our kids to like, oh, you've got to get better at everything. You know, oh, your English is falling behind. Oh, we got to fix that. I personally think in life in general, you should focus on your strengths and ignore your weaknesses because your weaknesses are always going to be your weaknesses. You can get them back up to here, but then they're still going to fall back as soon as you stop helping them. Whereas you focus on your strengths and you can go miles in that direction. So I know that I'm really good at interviews. I know that I can get the best out of my guests. I know that I can produce a product that people want to listen to. I don't know how to do all that marketing stuff. I don't know how to do the video stuff. So I'm just going to focus on that.
Yeah.
And might not get as many downloads, but I know that the people that do listen really appreciate it and really get something out of it.
And I guess that's really helpful for you as well, knowing that the people that are listening to your podcast are getting value out of it.
Yeah, I get really beautiful emails from listeners and messages on Instagram and people that just tell me, oh, I've listened to this one. It was really good. I loved this moment. And it's funny, like I was chatting to somebody recently and they were saying like, oh man, that one you did about the zombie song. I was like, what are you talking? Oh, right. From like 6 months ago. And yeah, oh, that was the best one you've done by far. And I was like, that one actually didn't get many downloads. And I thought it was really good as well. He was a friend of mine, but I didn't think it was better than some of the guests that I had to work really hard to get them on. So it's funny what connects with what people, and sometimes you think, oh, I don't know, it was a fine episode. But other people are like, oh, that's the one that really hit me here. So you never know. But I love hearing it. I'll never get sick of people saying how much they appreciate it, because I do put my heart and soul into each episode and really want people to get the most out of it. So when somebody does, like, seriously, write in the comments if you're enjoying these videos from Nathan, because he's doing a great job. And if people are getting something out of it, like, I'm sure Nathan would love to hear about it. So
I would. Yes.
Do it.
And it also helps with the algorithm engagement and all that. And to finish off today's episode, Aiden, do you have any hot takes?
Hot takes, like controversial corner or something like
something
this.
that you really believe in, but other people will be like, ooh, I don't know about that.
We mentioned earlier that podcasts can be a chance for mates to get together and chat. Just because you're funny at the pub doesn't mean you're going to be a good podcast host. Doesn't mean you can interview guests. Doesn't mean you're going to be any good. I often see like these, you know, look, this may have the hate in the comments, but you know those the uninspired, unemployed, or inspired employed guy. They do prank shows. There's a prank show that they do on Channel 10, Impractical Jokers, I think it's called.
Okay,
those guys are known for their funny videos, but somebody offered them a podcast contract and they were like, "Oh yeah, cool, we can do that." Can you? Just because you've got internet fame doesn't mean you can host a good podcast. I've worked really hard to get good at what I do. And some people have natural ability, absolutely. But just because you think you're funny, just because you can chat with your mates, doesn't mean it's going to be interesting for other people to listen to.
Yeah.
Is that controversial enough for you?
I think so.
Come at me.
Well, and thank you very much for joining us on the Your Story Studios podcast.
Thank you for having me, and go listen to Songs That Change You. Go check it out.
And leave a 5-star review.
Absolutely. Well, I will accept 4.5, but nothing less, please.